The stars were quiet that day, the light from the twin moons scattered across the capital world of the Empire, as if trying to veil the cruelty about to unfold in front of countless eyes across the galaxy. A platform had been built in the heart of the central square, silver and cold, surrounded by towering buildings and broadcast drones humming. Like vultures in the sky, the citizens of the Empire gathered in silence. Not out of sorrow, but out of fear. They had learned long ago that emotions were dangerous, and questioning the Empire meant consequences. The center of the platform stood a girl, her wrists bound behind her. She was no warrior, no soldier, no leader. Her name was Mira, a human from a quiet farming colony at the edge of the Empire's claimed space. Her clothes were simple, her face marked with dirt, but her eyes clear like ice, and in those eyes there was no fear, only a calm stillness that unsettled even the guards flanking her. The announcer's voice echoed across the plaza, loud and mechanical, repeating the charges with robotic precision. Treason, rebellion, refusal to comply with relocation orders, aiding insurgents harboring anti-empire beliefs. The words meant little to those watching from across the systems. They had heard the same lines used for countless others. It had become a ritual, an act of dominance wrapped in official language, a performance to remind the galaxy who held power. But something felt different this time as the executioner approached, his weapon raised for a clean and public strike. Mira lifted her head, her voice not loud, yet carried through every speaker, every channel, every hidden corner of the galaxy where a human watched in growing dread and rage. She spoke not in anger, not in despair, but with a quiet strength that pierced deeper than any scream. She said, "If this is peace, then we don't need it." And the silence that followed felt heavier than a warship. The blade fell clean and quick, and the broadcast ended with the Empire's seal burning across every screen, across 100 systems. The image of Mira's final moment repeated again and again, her voice echoing in the minds of those who watched her face. Unbroken, her words simple but eternal. It was meant to be a warning, but it became something else entirely. It became a spark on Earth. The message arrived, just like it did everywhere else. In the middle of the night, screens flickered on in homes, barracks, stations, orbiting labs, mining tunnels. Families gathered without speaking. Commanders paused their work. Soldiers looked up from their meals. Scientists stopped mid-sentence across continents. No orders were needed, no calls issued, and no debates held. There was only silence, and then movement, a slow and steady rise, like a storm pulling itself from the deep. Command centers lit up with life. Old codes that had never been used were activated. Screens turned red with symbols only a few ever trained to understand. Files locked for decades opened. With simple gestures, protocols marked classified beyond top level began to run on their own satellites, shifted their orbits. Weapons once hidden under oceans lifted toward the sky. Engines warmed across fleets buried in forgotten shipyards. Ships that hadn't moved in years began to hum again, as if they too had been waiting for this moment. The Omega Directive had been activated in the largest orbital station above Earth. A single sentence was spoken by a quiet figure seated at the center of the control chamber, his voice low yet certain, his eyes fixed on the final image of the girl, her body still on the cold floor of the Empire Square. He said, "We have 47 minutes. Cross the human colonies." The message spread not as panic, but as clarity. There was no confusion, no hesitation. Every soldier returned to station. Every pilot climbed into cockpits. Every technician reported for work. Even civilians knew what it meant and what had to be done, because this time it was not about politics or territory or revenge. It was about the line that had been crossed, the final line that could not be ignored. Ships left orbit, without celebration, without speeches. They moved like shadows, silent and precise, fleets of thousands gathering. Like a storm on the edge of space, ready not for battle, but for something greater, for the answer to a crime that demanded no courtroom and required no jury. The Empire watched the silence with amusement. Their officials mocked the human stillness, calling it weakness, calling it fear. They believed the message had been sent and received, and that the lesson had been delivered. But they did not understand. Humanity, they had never understood humanity. In their arrogance, they missed the way humanity waits, how it builds in silence, how it burns with memory, not noise, and when it moves, it does not tremble, it roars. As the 47th minute approached, the final preparations were complete. Coordinates, locked targets, marked fleets aligned at the pause edge of Empire territory, and in that last breath of stillness before retribution, the image of the girl once more appeared across every ship, every station, every eye, human and allied alike. Her voice replayed without music, without edit, her final words standing alone: if this is peace, then we don't need it. And in that moment, a species rose, not just in anger, but in unity. The kind of unity that comes not from governments, but from truth. They had executed a girl on live broadcast, believing it would crush resistance. Instead, it had awakened the oldest force in the universe. Not vengeance, not hatred, but the unstoppable power of a people who will never kneel again. And as the final second ticked down, the stars trembled, not from fear, but from what was coming next. The silence that followed the broadcast did not mean surrender. It did not mean shock. It meant preparation. It meant calculation. Behind that calm surface, humanity had begun to shift, not in fragments, but all at once, a collective force moving with a single mind, driven not by strategy alone, but by something deeper, something older, something built into the very core of who they were. On Luna Base, where the sky is always gray and machines never rest, an old general stood staring at the blinking red alerts crawling across the main screen. One word kept pulsing in the corner: Omega, a directive reserved only for the final line. A line that Myra's execution had crossed without hesitation. He did not call for meetings, did not ask for opinions. He simply spoke to the room full of officers who had been waiting with unspoken dread. It is time. The orders moved like lightning down communication lines, faster than sound, faster than thought. Entire fleets received coordinates so classified that even captains had never seen them before. Warships hidden for decades, powered up with smooth precision, their engines whispering in the darkness of deep space, their weapon systems awakening like beasts from ancient sleep. Their steel hulls glimmering beneath the light of distant stars. Earth thousands of kilometers beneath the surface, deep in the core defense bunkers. A group of scientists in gray suits unlocked a vault sealed since the founding of the Planetary Union. Inside were codes forged, not for war, but for survival programs designed not to conquer, but to end any threat that believed humanity would stay silent after harm had been done to one of their own. Mira's name had been entered into the system, not as a password, not as a command, but as a purpose. And once that name lit up across the global grid, every defense satellite realigned, every drone fleet changed course, every orbital cannon rotated toward the heart of the Empire. The colonies on Mars, Venus, Europa, and beyond answered without pause, despite distance and delay. There was no confusion. The girl had not been a soldier, not a politician, not a symbol until now. She had become the reason why hesitation no longer had room to breathe. In the deserts of the Red Planet, a young pilot climbed into her fighter as engines flared around her sky, glowing with rows of ships ready to depart. She did not look angry. She did not speak words of vengeance. Her face was calm like ice, her eyes holding only one question: how far would they go to protect one of their owning? The depths of the asteroid belt. Mining ships, retrofitted for defense, joined the cause, their hulls scratched and scarred from years of labor, now carrying missiles instead of cargo. Their crews silent and focused as they turned toward the Empire's borders, their navigation systems locked on a path that had been drawn up long before the execution ever happened. The Empire still laughed, still broadcast messages filled with pride, claiming victory, calling Mira's death a warning, reminding the galaxy that resistance meant erasure. Their leaders watched the human stillness and misread it again, believing they had won again, believing that fear had done its job again. But fear no longer lived in the hearts of those who watched Mira fall. What lived there now was memory, and memory, when shared across a billion minds, becomes something else entirely. It becomes movement, and movement without hesitation becomes foresight. The edge of Empire space near a dead moon orbiting a blue gas. Giant humanity's first wave of ships arrived not with sound, not with threat, not with banners or warnings. They came in complete silence. Stealth fields, active weapons, cold eyes scanning every detail of the system around them. They did not fire. They did not speak. They waited for the 47th minute. The minute that would mark the end of one age and the beginning of another. The minute when silence would finally break. Not with a word, but with fire inside the command center of the lead ship. A captain stood at the observation window, her hands behind her back, her gaze fixed on the Empire's nearest relay station. Her crew stood ready, no panic, no tension, only focus. Her voice soft yet firm, she asked for the time. One of the officers responded. 45 minutes past. The stars seemed to hold their breath. On the Empire's capital world where Mira had taken her last breath, the city glowed in celebration. Fireworks cracked above towers, music played through the streets. Statues of the Empress gleamed under the artificial suns they believed they had taught the galaxy a lesson. They believed they had shown what power truly looked like. They had not seen the fleets gathering just outside their sensor range. They had not detected the shadows moving closer with every second. They had not heard the whisper that moved from ship to ship like a secret, shared in a storm. Her name, Myra. 1 minute left. Humans did not pray. They did not scream. They did not wait for permission. Every ship moved as one. Every soldier breathed in silence. Every system flashed green. Every lock disengaged. Every target confirmed. 47 minutes since the execution. The sky tore open. From thousands of points across the Empire's outer rim, human ships burst into real space engines, roaring weapons, charging missiles. Launched before alarms even triggered defense systems. Too late, sensors too blind to catch what had been planned across years. What had been activated in seconds. Communication towers shattered before warnings could be sent. Orbital defenses blinked out in fire stations crumbled before a single soldier stepped foot on the ground, and still no message from humanity. No declaration, no demand, only action. The Empress watched in confusion, screens flickering, static alarms screaming below her throne. Command centers calling for orders, none arriving. Her advisors frozen, her generals silent, and above all the image of the girl playing again and again on the screen, as if the system itself remembered what had been done. Humanity had moved not for conquest, not for power, but for her, for Mira. The war had not begun. It had ended in that moment, because those who thought fear would protect them had forgotten the one rule humanity had never broken: hurt one of us, and you answer to all of us. And the answer had come in fire. The moment the human ships came out of the void, space was no longer quiet. It did not explode in noise, but in movement. It felt as if something ancient had opened its eyes, and now everything in its way would be swept aside. The capital system of the Empire had once been considered untouchable, surrounded by rings of defense stations, planetary shields, and fleets of loyal warships. Yet in the first second of the assault, 6 of those stations went dark, their power cores pierced by kinetic weapons traveling faster than thought, their remains drifting in silence, their alarms still ringing in pieces across the black sky. Human fleet did not come in waves. It came as a wall, an unstoppable tide of ships built not with glory in mind but survival, designed not to intimidate, but to erase. Every ship was marked not with symbols or names, but with one single word. Mira etched into steel, engraved across hulls, painted over cockpits, a message sent with no need for translation, a message that burned brighter than any fleet insignia ever could on the surface of the capital world. Panic spread faster than light. The Empire had never been attacked on its own ground, not in living memory, not since the age of planetary expansion, when wars were fought with swords and skyships. Now the streets that had once celebrated their strength were filled with silence, broken only by the sound of sirens that came too late and screams that rose from confusion, not understanding inside. The central tower of control officers moved between consoles, trying to understand what had gone wrong, how their satellites had failed, how their early warning systems had seen nothing but static, how human ships had reached their core in under An hour without setting off a single sensor, and every question met the same answer. They underestimated what silence meant. They misunderstood what grief looked like when it came from humans. Above them, human ships formed a pattern across the upper atmosphere, each holding position as precision strikes fell from orbit, their energy weapons carving through the outer walls of government centers without touching civilian blocks, their drones disabling military aircraft before they could lift. From runways, their boarding teams dropping into the largest towers from above, using gravity as their ally and silence as their weapon. Empire had numbers but no focus. Their fleets scrambled to respond, but their commands were broken, their communication lines severed, their leaders too slow to understand that they were not facing a rebellion. They were facing a species that had decided to end something, and when humans decide to end something, they do not pause for permission or diplomacy. They do not ask for justice, they deliver it with finality. In the orbit above the second moon, a human battlecruiser locked onto the Empire's central transmission hub, the same one that had broadcast Mira's execution live across 100 worlds. Its antenna still pointed toward the stars, still replaying her final words on a loop before the order came. The ship's captain paused, looking once more at the image on her screen, the girl standing on the platform. Her voice steady, her eyes calm. If this is peace, then we don't need it. And then with a single nod the order was given, and the hub shattered into pieces, glowing like falling stars as it broke apart over the moon's pale surface. Resistance came too late when it came in. Confusion, fighters launched without coordination, cruisers without orders, their movements predictable, their formations broken. They were not ready for the kind of war that had no warning, that came not for land or resources but for a girl, a single girl whose life had become the spark that burned away the illusion of control inside the lower cities. Civilians hid not because the humans attacked them, but because they did not know what to expect. They had only seen the propaganda, only heard that humans were violent, irrational, dangerous, and now they saw ships move with purpose, not destruction. They saw buildings spared when they held no threat. They saw medics assisting wounded without asking for names. They saw the enemy show more discipline than their rulers ever had. The Empire's soldiers fought back where they could, but they were not ready for the tactics used by the human ground teams who moved through streets like wind, fast, quiet, precise. Every motion calculated, every step placed with purpose. They did not fire unless needed. They did not destroy what did not resist, and still they moved like a storm that could not be stopped. In one of the towers near the old war ministry, a general watched from behind, shattered glass, face marked with disbelief, his eyes hollow. He whispered that it was impossible, that no force could move this fast, this clean, this absolute. And behind him, a young soldier, barely more than a boy, replied without fear, they did it for her. The galaxy news spread faster than ships ever could. Rebel colonies under Empire rule saw the broadcast shared by humans, saw the images of Empire fleets burning, saw the footage of Myra, her final words, her quiet bravery, and they began to rise. Not with weapons, but with truth, no longer afraid of the shadow cast by a throne that now trembled in its own core. The Empire's communication blackout failed to hold the signal, leaked through abandoned satellites, broken drones, hijacked relay beacons, and what once had been used to spread fear now became the channel of freedom. Mira's voice speaking again and again, until even the Empire's own citizens no longer turned away from the sound. By the time the 47th minute passed, the sky over the capital had changed. The glow of the twin suns faded behind the smoke of destroyed cruisers and the burn trails of drop pods. The air no longer echoed with prideful music, but with silence filled by memory and consequence, and the streets once lit with banners now filled with footsteps of those who had never forgotten what it meant to be human. At the center of the ruined square, where the platform still stood, a human soldier placed a single stone on the ground, carved with a name, Mira, nothing more, nothing less, and stepped away without a word. Behind him came others, some human, some not, placing stones without music, without applause, until the ground shimmered with the weight of memory, not carved by machines but by Hands that remembered, and above all the world in the blackness of space. The human fleet began to pull away, not to occupy, not to conquer, but to leave their message clear, their purpose finished, their silence returned. Had answered smoke still, rose from the broken towers of the capital world, but the battle had ended. The ships that once circled the skies with fire had begun to pull back, their engines humming low like a warning that never fades, and below where once the streets had echoed with the voice of the Empress, now there was only the soft sound of footsteps moving through the rubble, not in fear, but in thought. As citizens stepped outside, not as subjects, but as people no longer forced to pretending the center of the city where the execution platform had once stood. The ground had been cleared by human soldiers. Not for display, not for glory, but for something quiet, something sacred. The square now held a circle of stones, each one placed by a hand that remembered each one, carved with a single letter until the full name was written across the earth, not in a banner, not in flames, but in silence. Mirashi had never fired a weapon, had never led a movement, had never written a speech, but her words had crossed systems, and her death had united a species in ways no treaty ever could across the galaxy. People whispered her name not in sorrow, but in power in schools. Her final message became a lesson not about war, but about dignity, about standing without fear, even when there is no one left beside you on Earth. In the chambers of leadership, no flags were raised, no medals given. The leader sat in silence as the footage of the girl played once again, not edited, not filtered, her voice raw, her face calm, as if she knew that her death would not be the end, but the beginning. And across the walls of that chamber one sentence was written, not by order, but by instinct: if this is peace, then we don't need it. And from those words came a new law signed by every colony, every faction, every station that bore the human mark. The law was simple and final. No civilization, no empire, no council had the right to harm civilians. For political control, no life could be taken as a message. No rule could exist if it stood on the bones of the innocent. And this law was not guarded by courts or papers. It was guarded by memory, by action, by the silent agreement of a species that had once walked through fire and now refused to be burned again. On the outer colonies, former members of the Empire, who had watched in silence, began to remove the symbols of the throne. They took down the statues. They lowered the flags. They erased the names of those who had ruled with fear and replaced them, not with new rulers, but with open halls where all could speak. And at the heart of each hall, they placed a circle of stone, simple and clean, with Mira's name at the center, not as a goddess, not as a leader, but as a reminder of what silence can become when it is broken with truth. All across the galaxy, the message was not revenge. The message was not power. The message was choice. The choice to remember, the choice to protect, the choice to never look away again. And in every human ship that returned from battle, there was no celebration, no loud cheers, only quiet hands, cleaning their tools, repairing what was damaged, and carrying the memory of one girl whose voice had done more than any fleet ever could. In a quiet village far from the cities, deep in the hills of a farming world, her family stood by the fields, not dressed in black, not surrounded by ceremony. They looked up at the sky where the stars still glowed, where ships moved like shadows across the darkness, and they knew she was gone, but they also knew she had changed the stars. And in that knowledge, they did not weep. They planted a tree, and at the base of that tree, they placed a stone, and on that stone, they wrote her name in letters carved by hand, not to mark a grave, but to mark the place where her journey had begun. Among the ruins of the Empire, voices began to rise, not in praise of the throne, but in questions. How had they allowed fear to rule? How had they let cruelty become law? And who among them had dared to believe that one life meant nothing when, in truth, one life had shifted the stars themselves? And in the silence that followed these questions, there came no answers, only the wind moving through broken towers and the memory of a voice that refused to be forgotten. The Empress herself had vanished, her escape vessel gone, her signal silent, and no one searched for her, not even her loyal guards, who now stood alone in empty halls. unsure if they had ever truly believed or if they had only obeyed because silence had been easier than truth, and in their eyes, now was not anger, but something heavier, the weight of regret. Among the stars, the human fleet did not return to parade. They returned to work, to building, to healing, and to watching, not with suspicion, but with purpose, ready not to strike again, but to ensure that no one would ever have to speak final words on a cold platform with a blade above their head ever again. Their strength was no longer in weapons, but in memory, and from that memory came unity. Allies came from places once hostile, voices joined from species that had feared humans once, but now saw them not as conquerors, but as protectors, not as rulers, but as reminders of what happens when silence becomes resistance, and resistance becomes change, and change is held not by power, but by the will to never forget. In the academy above the rings of Saturn, where future leaders of Earth's colonies were trained, the story of Mira became the first lesson taught, not for sorrow, but for clarity. Her life, her courage, her final words became the foundation of a new understanding that leadership does not begin with power, it begins with purpose, and her purpose had shaken the stars. In the very halls where once the Empire's orders were set across the stars, now stood voices of peace, voices of law, voices of unity. Who knew that fear had failed and truth had risen, and above those halls, carved into the steel ceiling, were words from a girl who had stood alone and changed everything. If this is peace, then we don't need it. The stars did not forget. The stars had changed. Their silence no longer felt empty. It carried memory, weight, truth. And across every system where once the Empire's banner had flown, there was now only stillness and new breath, the kind that follows a long storm, the kind that does not rush but allows time to settle. The human fleets had returned to their skies, not to rule, not to conquer, but to guard. They had delivered their answer and left without demand, without threat, without promise, only with a single message: never again. And Empire was gone, not by vote, not by surrender, but by collapse. Its voice lost, its reach broken, its symbols shattered. No more messages sent from thrones, no more cities ruled by fear, no more names forced into mouths of children who no longer needed to kneel. And in the places once filled with pride and steel, now stood halls of quiet, where voices from all sides spoke without chains, where silence was not a prison, but a moment of choice. Girl who had stood alone on that cold platform had become more than memory. She had become meaning, her name now carved into monuments. Not high, not golden, not towering, but simple, low stones placed in circles, touched by sunlight, marked by those who had once looked away and now remembered. Those circles appeared on moon stations, colonies, deserts, and mountain peaks, placed not by governments but by hands who had felt the shift in the stars. In one corner of a green world, far from the centers of power, a child stood with his father in front of one such circle. It was made of stone and soil, with flowers blooming on its edges. And in the center sat a tree, tall, strong, its roots wrapped around a smooth rock. On that rock, only one word was written: Mira. And the child asked, "Who is she?" And the father answered without looking away from the leaves moving in the breeze, "She was a girl, and because of her we remember what it means to be more than quiet." The new alliance formed not from ashes, but from memory, took no name, it had no ruler, it had no flag, it was not bound by empire or council. It was held together by one belief: that no voice should be silenced, that no life should be ended to teach fear, and that unity comes not from power, but from the will to stand when others fall, from the choice to protect without reward, and from the understanding that peace without dignity is not peace at all. Humanity did not build thrones or place themselves above others. They listened, they guarded, they remained ready, not to strike, but to shield. And that readiness became legend, not because of the fire they had unleashed, but because of how quickly they had stepped back, how they had left. No mark of conquest, only silence, only the echo of one voice that had reminded the stars who humans truly were. In the deep space beyond the map, systems explorers carried her name on their ships, not as armor, not as flag, but as compass. And in every new outpost built, every agreement signed, every planet charted, her words stood in the first page of every book of law. Her face shone in the first room of every training hall. Her story told not for sorrow but for strength, not for revenge but for reminder there were still those who feared humanity, who spoke in whispers, who warned of what had happened to the Empire. But those voices were few, and they were drowned not by noise but by truth, for even they knew that Mira had not fallen because she had threatened war. She had fallen because she had spoken her mind, and when the Empire struck it, had written its own ending in that moment. There were worlds that had once turned away when help was asked, who now reached out without waiting, who opened doors before they were knocked and asked how they too could stand for something more than silence. And in those places humans arrived not as warriors but as builders, not with ships of war, but with hands ready to lift what was broken, to repair what had been lost, to offer not power but presence. Statue of the Empress was gone, melted not by weapons, but by her own people, taken down piece by piece until nothing stood where she once looked over her city, in its place a new circle of stone, surrounded by grass, without walls, without guards, where citizens now sat in quiet on mornings, watching the sun rise, and at the heart of the circle, a tree grown from the seeds brought from Myra's home world, its branches stretching across the sky, its roots sinking deep into the ground, as if they too had found a place to rest above that world in the sky that had once burned with fire. Human ships moved in formation. Not for battle, but for watch, they passed without sound, without fear, their paths written in light across the black, as steady as the pulse of time, and every ship carried a name, etched not on the outside, but within, in the hearts of those who guided them, a name that did not fade, a name that did not need thunder to be heard in the great halls of learning. Children now studied not the rise of empires, but the fall of fear. They read not about battles, but about choices, about voices that spoke even when they were alone, about the kind of strength that does not seek to rule, but to remind, and every lesson began the same with the voice of a girl, calm, steady, her words simple: if this is peace, then we don't need it. Time moved forward as it always does. Stars were born, others faded, ships crossed systems, messages flowed across satellites, and history was written again, but always in the margins, in the corners of books, on the walls of stations. Whispered in classrooms, told in stories, sung in songs, there was the echo of that moment, the memory of the choice humanity had made, not to dominate, but to protect, not to rise above, but to rise with. And though Mira was gone, her presence remained. Not in shadows, not in sorrow, but in motion and silence, in the calm that follows after a voice has spoken the truth. And no one dares to forget the Empire had executed a human girl to silence her voice. But that voice had become a wave, a flame, a mirror, and in that mirror, the galaxy had seen itself not as it was, but as it could be. And in that moment everything changed forever, and the stars will never forget her name. The end.